a moment at the end of the webinar to answer 3 short questions for us. Thank you. We will begin momentarily. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Benefits of Voting in Local Elections webinar. We have an awesome webinar prepared for you today with data and insights from our field programs. So I'm really excited to share all of this with you today. If you missed it earlier, you can interact with us. Use the chat to send us your thoughts, but please use the Q&A box to send us your questions. That's how we moderate them and keep track of them. The chat can get a little busy and hard to keep track of. So we're going to start today with just going over some of the benefits of voting and voter engagement. Then we will get into the impacts of nonprofits engaging voters in local elections and actually look at real impact that nonprofits had in the 2019 election cycle. And then we will have Alex McHenry from Community Resource Center share how CRC's Colorado Participation Project engages voters in off-year local elections. So what are the benefits of voting? I think there are many benefits to voting, but and there's a lot of research on this topic as we really sort through and figure out how this actually impacts voters and how it impacts organizations. So we'll start with voters. There are really huge benefits for the people you serve as voters. First of all, there's social connections. Voters tend to have stronger social connections, leading to greater quality of life and longevity. And census surveys suggest that regular voters are, compared to voters who participate less frequently, more strongly connected with their neighbors and family members. They're more likely to discuss political issues with families or do favors for their neighbors. Voting also impacts personal agency. They have the satisfaction of knowing that they've expressed their opinions. Voting is a form of personal empowerment that gives you the opportunity to use your voice on issues that matter to you, your family, and your community. Voting also fosters community-based leadership. So as community members are mobilized to vote, leaders from within the community often emerge, including those interested in seeking office. And communities that vote are more likely to elect representatives that reflect the diversity and interests of their communities. So we know that voting is good for the people who vote. There's a lot of research on the social determinants of health and how voting is part of that. And we're going to be diving into that in future webinars. But there's also really great impacts and benefits for nonprofit organizations doing this work. And I'm speaking specifically to nonprofits, but we've also seen a rising amount of voter engagement activity among businesses and our corporate counterparts. So we know we're really on the right track and there's a lot of benefits that we can receive as nonprofits. The first is that we just build power and influence this way. So when our nonprofits start registering voters, candidates take notice. And this gives our constituents and communities more opportunities to hear directly from candidates on issues that affect their lives. It also means elected officials will recognize your organization as one with an engaged community of voters. For any organization that does advocacy work, I think voter engagement absolutely needs to be a part of that. Voters are more likely to advocate for their communities and to participate in other ways, like contacting an elected official or signing up to be a poll worker or volunteering for a campaign. So if you build a list of voters that you engage in the summer and fall, those constituents can bolster your advocacy efforts in the winter and spring when lawmakers are in session. And elected officials really listen to the people who actually vote in their community. It can also really expand your organization's reach. So getting involved in voter engagement creates opportunities to expand your presence in the community. Your activities can draw in members of the community who haven't used your services in the past. And voter engagement events are great places to plug in volunteers. So your organization can tap into new partnerships by finding other orgs doing voter engagement work, or by offering to conduct nonpartisan voter engagement activities for the people that they serve. So partnering up is, and building relationships is part of this too. So, you could take this from me, obviously I have a vested interest in getting more nonprofits to do voter engagement work. But in fact, we hear from nonprofits too, that they're seeing a lot of benefits. So here's what they're saying. We were pleased with the traction we received on social media. This will likely lead to long-term engagement in our organization's work through these platforms. So we consider this a win-win. So this is a quote from a nonprofit organization that worked with us in the 2020 cycle. And so they really built up their social media presence and strategy. So that's going to have impacts for them beyond just the voter engagement work. Another partner said that volunteer opportunities the volunteer opportunities created helped people facing social isolation be able to connect with others. So that was really big in a year of social distancing with COVID, but I think that can continue to be a real benefit. You can plug in your volunteers, people that you serve or who are supporters, and give them opportunities to engage with their community and feel more connected. The last one we have for you is really about how their work actually benefited their own staff. So this organization said, we distributed voting guides intended to keep staff informed so they could pass along information to their clients and residents, but many employees shared that the info was helpful for their own reference when voting in this election. So don't forget your staff, don't leave them out. They're going to benefit from this work as well. So we want to hear from you. So we have a little poll. We want to know what motivates your organization to engage voters. Now, it's single choice. You can't select multiple. And I'm sure for most of us, it might be multiple things happening here. But we want to know, is it the benefits to voters that really motivates you, or are the benefits to your nonprofit very attractive? I think a lot of organizations know that it feels right and it's the right thing to do, but maybe they haven't really articulated and defined for their organization why this is so important for them to do. Maybe some of you aren't engaging voters yet. And many of you engage voters explicitly as part of your mission. That's the work you do. That's the reason you were formed. So we'll take a moment to hear from all of you about your motivations. All right, once we get past, 50 or 60%, I think we can close the poll and take a look at the results. So for a lot of you, it's part of your mission, which is great. And then the second biggest chunk, it's really the benefits to voters. And that's great. For whatever reason you're doing voter engagement, it's a great reason as long as it's a nonpartisan one. But I encourage you all to explore the different reasons why this could be a good fit for your organization and the kinds of impacts it can have. I don't think everyone can see the slides at this point. Oh, yes, they can. Sorry. So, I'm on this happy note, all these good things, why engaging voters is so beneficial to voters and to our orgs. But we do have a problem on our hands. And that problem is really low turnout in local elections. So some research shows that only about 1 in 5 eligible voters turns out for mayoral elections. And there's some reasons that researchers have identified for why this might be. There's less media coverage of these elections. Local government can feel obscure. When I remember my civics education, it was much more about Congress and the federal government. And I really didn't learn about local elections and local government. And to be honest, I'm still not 100% sure about what a county commissioner is. Many people are skeptical of the system. They don't necessarily believe that their vote will count. They think it's sort of an insider's club. Some folks just have less connection to their city, especially if they're highly mobile and maybe they move from city to town. And then there's also just the voting process itself can be hard. The election dates can feel really random if they're not on that Tuesday in November. The primaries can be confusing because they may only be open to people enrolled in one party. And so this can confuse people about whether or not they're eligible. A lot of local elections will have limited early voting options. There's might be limited outreach from election offices. And if you don't check your mail and see that, that postcard, you might never realize that there's an election coming up. And then of course, these campaigns are generally much smaller. The campaigns have fewer resources, and that means they're outreaching to fewer voters. So all these things really contribute to a huge gap of eligible voters not turning out in these really important local elections that really impact our day-to-day lives. But there's hope because nonprofits are proven to make an impact. So now I want to pass it over to Brian Miller, the executive director at Nonprofit Vote. And he's going to share some exciting data that we've been sitting on from our 2019 voter engagement field program, some other ideas on how nonprofits can really break through in local election cycles. So Brian, I will turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Caitlin. And so Kimberly, if you can advance to the next slide here first. Actually, so picking up on what we just talked about, again, the reality is we have very low turnout in these elections, right? For all the reasons Caitlin just articulated. The first thing, I guess, to jump in here is that is generally viewed as a negative, and it is. Off-cycle elections draw a fraction of the interest one sees in presidential and midterms, and that's in part the third-party groups. There's fewer organizations out there knocking on doors. There's fewer organizations, getting people to the polls in various ways. But there's a silver lining to that, which is that nonprofits can more readily see their impact. I mean, play it out for a second for you. If you're in a small community, maybe there's a town of 80,000 folks and only about 10 or 15,000 folks vote in the local election. If your organization is getting 1,000 of those people to the polls, that is a huge chunk of the electorate, which means you are having a significant impact. Whatever races are happening, mayoral races, city council races, your folks will have the mobilizing your folks is going to have a more notable impact on the representation that community has, thanks to the fact that, again, you can take advantage of that, basically work it to your advantage. It's still, as a broad concept, we want to boost turnout in these local elections. And so, and we did a study back, and before I get into the 2019 study, I want to rewind the tape back to 2015, which is several years ago, when we did another study where we looked at what's called net registration rates. And this kind of ties into this zig when others zag, right? Which is, and this was done in an off-cycle elections where we ran a voter registration program, and Kimberly, you can advance to the next one, We ran a voter registration program across 5 states that year. And we did a randomized controlled experiment where we had a number of organizations just doing raffles. They were just doing raffles, collecting addresses and phone numbers, whatever. And then we had another group of folks registering people to vote and doing the raffle and registering people to vote. And not to get into the methodology there, but there's an argument to some people make that, you know, sometimes the voter registration activities that we're doing, there's an argument to be made that if we didn't register these people to vote, somebody else would have, right? And there's some truth to that. You know, if we don't register these people to vote, maybe they'll get registered at a bus stop registration drive or at the DMV. What we're able to show is that over half of the folks that we engaged would not have been contacted or touched by anyone else, and therefore they would not have been registered to vote as part of that process. And while that's positive in its own right, it's also positive in that it favors, compared very favorably to other site-based programs, meaning that the folks who registered to vote at nonprofits, food pantries, health centers, were more likely to be net new registrants than those who are registered to vote at a bus stop or in front of a grocery store and so forth. But again, it's a higher overall net registration rate, in part because it took place in an off year. And go ahead and advance to the next one there. And so, you know, one of the things we want to consider is, what is the impact of nonprofits in off-cycle elections? You know, can nonprofits have a measurable impact? And so we looked at the data from our 2019 field program. Nonprofit Vote ran a modest program. It's significantly smaller than the program we run in major election years. But we collected the names and addresses of the people who we registered to vote, and we matched that data to the voter files in order to assess the demographics of who we were reached. We were also able to look at the impact on turnout. Did the folks we registered to vote or pledged to vote or otherwise engage turn out at higher rates than other voters? So we did this, we worked with about 50 nonprofits across 4 states. You can see Ohio, Colorado, North Carolina, Mississippi. We had about a number of more voters that we engaged, but 3,000 of which we had enough data to do this analysis with. And so the first thing to go into is the demographics of who we engaged. And go ahead and advance to the next one. And so the first comparison we did with that analysis is we looked at, of the voters that we engaged in this process, how do they compare to other registered voters in the same communities? And the basic takeaway is that there are roughly 1.5 or almost 1.5 times as likely to be low income or have incomes less than $30,000. They were over twice as likely to be young voters, that is, voters under 25 years of age. And they were significantly more likely to be people of color. In this case, this particular year, we had a much, much higher engagement of Latino communities, Latinx communities, 4 times as likely. But they were also more likely to be Black and AAPI as well. And only about 1/3 is likely to be white. That is, the registered voters in the broader community were 3 times as likely to be white as the folks we were engaging. So we know we're reaching a target audience that is underrepresented in the electorate, particularly in these off-cycle elections, because when turnout drops all the way down to 10 or 20%, the electorate also gets a lot whiter and a lot older. And so this engagement work that we're able to do in these off cycles helps counteract that. Go to advance to the next slide. Then from there, we look at the impacts on actual turnout. And what we can see is that in these communities in 2019, 27.8% or just under 28% of the voters, comparable voters, voted in those elections. The voters who engaged at the nonprofits voted at 32.3%, right? So that's about a 4.5 percentage point turnout advantage that the folks we engaged had over their comparable voters. But that, in a way, that kind of understates it. And I'm going to play a little. If you look at the role, if you look at the base of 27.8%, 4.5 percentage point is actually a 16% increase over the base of turnout. That's a percentage of voters, not the percentage point. But nonetheless, it is a very positive impact regardless. And that is in part because of the work that we did with these nonprofits. Go ahead and advance to the next one. But it's not just that they boosted overall turnout, it's that they narrowed the gaps, right? When we engage these voters, the biggest turnout advantage came from those most likely or least likely to vote otherwise, right? So when you look at it by age, younger voters had a 9.9 percentage point turnout advantage when engaged by the nonprofits. And as you can see, that turnout advantage goes down the older you get. Part of that is intuitive, because if you're part of a community that's already voting at 45%, there's not as much space for growth. When you engage these lower propensity, or as we like to call higher potential voters, you can have a bigger impact on their turnout rates. Again, as you can see with the younger voters. Go ahead and advance to the next one. Same thing with when you look at it by race, you can see significant turnout advantages. The biggest turnout advantages came with non-white communities, Black, Latinx, et cetera. And go ahead and advance to the next one, which is education level. And once again, if you look at those with the non-college voters, they had a 5.5 percentage point turnout advantage, right? And you can see the turnout advantage in the graph is lower for the college voters. And again, the blue bar is the nonprofit voters, the black bar is the comparable voters. So again, with the non-likely, you can see that there's a bigger impact that the nonprofits are having. And the reason this is important is because this is about narrowing participation gaps, right? Our goal at Nonprofit Vote are the first, when we look at policies, when we look at strategies, the very first thing we hold up, the lens we hold up is, does it promote equity? Does it close participation gaps and foster a more representative electorate? And this research really shows that yes, nonprofits in off-cycle elections absolutely do have an impact in narrowing those participation gaps. And that's the good news. I'm going to advance to the next slide. But as we saw earlier, local elections are different. They're fundamentally different. As Caitlin showed that slide earlier where she articulated a number of the reasons why turnout is low. This is from the National Civic League, and they're citing some of the same research, which basically says that local elections have lower turnout in large part because of a lack of awareness of the candidates and issues, a lack of understanding of the functions of local elected officials and their impacts on daily life. And I would add a lack of awareness that there's even an election taking place. When you're dealing with some of these low salience mayoral elections or city council elections, a lot of times people don't even know it's happening. Go ahead and advance to the next one. Which brings to mind something really important for us to keep in mind, is that registering voters is not enough when you're dealing with off-cycle elections. Even when registered, voters still don't participate in local elections in large numbers. And as we mentioned earlier, the demographics of how that electorate looks changes as a result. The lack of awareness and information is, I would say, the core barrier to participation in off-cycle elections, even for registered voters. And so, we are dealing with very different realities, and as a result, we need very different strategies. And so voter registration is still important, it still has value, but that work should be complemented with voter education and get out to vote work to really be impactful in local election cycles. And go ahead and advance to the next one. And, these are just a few of the examples of the kind of voter education and get out to vote that your nonprofit could do. Is educating voters about what races are taking place, whether it's mayoral, school board, city council, or whatever. Or maybe there's a ballot measure. A lot of times there's tax measures on the ballot as well. The issues that are being impacted, schools, police, transportation. Again, as that National Civic League study noted, or article referenced, is that it's important to remind voters what these local government officials do. The mayor doesn't just sit in an office collecting a salary. The school board doesn't just, they're actually managing things, important local infrastructure that has a direct impact on people's lives. Obviously, key dates, options for voting and polling locations, and of course, getting out actual election reminders and getting out the vote. So, again, the big key takeaways before I close out is that, we know from our research that nonprofits can have a very positive impact in off-cycle elections. They reach a target demographic that's often overlooked, and they have a very positive impact on voter turnout. And as we mentioned earlier, because you're dealing with such low turnout elections to begin with, that positive impact means that the nonprofits can have a bigger overall say, a relative voice through the work that they're doing. But again, the realities of these local elections are different, which means we need to adjust our strategies to build in more focus on the voter education and GOTV, and not just rely on registration drives, because that by itself isn't enough. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Caitlin. I don't think we hear you.
Thanks, Brian. Sorry about that. I'm really excited to have our guest speaker today. We have Alex McHenry from Community Resource Center. I was lucky enough to work with Alex last year on an exciting and rough, but also inspiring year on the voter engagement program. And we're working together this year as well. So I'm excited for Alex to tell you more about Colorado Participation Project and what they have in store for their voters this year. Alex, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. Hello, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Alex McHenry. I use she, her pronouns, and excited to be here today to hopefully build off this conversation and share a little bit about what this has looked like for us here at Community Resource Center in the field as we run our voter engagement program, and some tactics we've used specifically in these sort of off-election years to engage voters beyond registration. So we can go to the next slide. And before I dive into all of that, just wanted to give some brief background to our organization. Folks on this call are from all over the place, but the Community Resource Center is a capacity building nonprofit. We are based in Colorado, and we work statewide, providing opportunities, tools, and strategies to nonprofits and community groups across the state to further their missions. We can go to the next slide. And specifically, the programs I oversee here at Community Resource Center are our civic engagement and advocacy programs. The one I will be talking about today is the Colorado Participation Project mentioned by Caitlin. So we partner with nonprofit Vote to help advance voter engagement work across the state with nonprofits by providing guidance, training, and support to mostly direct service organizations to help them integrate civic engagement efforts into their service delivery. We can go to the next slide. And so probably this doesn't need to be said on a webinar like this, given the folks here, but some people do ask us, why so much of a focus on voter engagement when we are a capacity building organization and we have many other focuses and ways that we support organizations. And this is really our why statement. And we believe that the policies and political priorities that we see do not often reflect the wills and needs and priorities of traditionally disenfranchised communities, and those often most impacted by those policies and priorities. And those are those high potential voters that we talk about. And we really believe that nonprofits play a really important role in being trusted messengers and bringing this information and access to those communities. So we can go to the next slide. And this was kind of already touched on earlier by Caitlin and Brian, but we really work with our nonprofits to understand that it's not just about voting. It's really about having more engaged and civically active communities and constituents. So last year we did a lot of work around the census and ensuring folks could respond to the census. This year we're doing work around the redistricting process. But the Participation Project has been around for over 10 years. It was started in 2010, and we've been doing this work every year since. It was adopted by the Community Resource Center in 2015, but we really work with nonprofits to support this work year round and year after year. So it's not just something that comes up every 4 years when there's an election. And as mentioned earlier in this webinar, we really believe in those impacts at the individual, community, and organizational level that you see when your organization is continually involved in this process. We can go to the next slide. And so how our program works is we always offer voter registration. That is a key part of it. But as Brian was just mentioning, especially in these off-year elections, it's really more than offering registration. There's a lot of other barriers that exist that maybe prevent people from voting in the end. And so we really talk about our program in these 4 areas. So we offer voter registration. We also collect pledges to vote, and I'll talk about what those look like, but collecting folks' information, having them, write down somewhere that, yes, they intend to vote, and a way for us to follow up with them later. We do a lot of work around voter education, and I will be sharing some of the tools we use to engage folks in those conversations and ensure they have the information that they need. And then we do a lot of get out the vote. So phone calls, you can see Emily on this slide is making some phone calls. We work with nonprofit organizations to ensure that anyone they've engaged throughout this process, whether they've collected a registration or a pledge card from them, they're receiving some follow-up reminders leading up to the election in a method that they chose to ensure that they know when those deadlines are, where to access, ballot drop boxes, key deadlines, everything like that. We can go to the next slide. I know there's been some chat going on in the chat box, but do want to reiterate that everything we do is nonpartisan. We're a 501c3. We are supporting other 501c3 organizations. So all of our voter engagement work is nonpartisan. We're never supporting or opposing political parties or candidates. But there is still a lot nonprofits can do. And I really believe that this is a strength of our sector and builds trust, and community members know that they can go to their local nonprofits and receive nonpartisan, unbiased information that they can trust. And I think that's a large reason for the success of programs and this model like ours. Go to the next slide. So what does this, I think I was asked to speak on the panel today just about what this really looks like in the field. What are the conversations? It's really easy to talk about voter engagement. It's much harder to do in practice. And I think the biggest thing we've learned, regardless of the election year really, is listening first. And we always have scripts created for our partner organizations to use for organizers in the field. But they're very fluid, and we like to start with questions. We have a lot of information we could provide folks, but if we don't know what their hesitation or barriers are, or the questions that they have, then we might be making false assumptions about what they know, what they don't know, and what they need in order to feel comfortable voting. So we have used this tool you're seeing on the right side of the screen. It's called the Why Vote tool. It was created by the Right Question Institute. So if anyone's interested, can look it up and gain access. It was meant more for a training setting in a room, but we sort of have adapted it into a one-page laminated sheet. So what you're seeing on the screen is the front side of that sheet. So we have these laminated out in the field. They were easy to wipe down and clean off for safety precautions. And what you're seeing is icons of different government services that are offered. And an easy first question is just to ask someone which of these services is most important to them. Which one do they care most about? And oftentimes people do have an answer to this question, whether it's healthcare, childcare, employment, housing. These things are really true to whatever their needs are at that moment and what they're passionate about. And then kind of asking them, why would they maybe want to have a say in who's making decisions about these services, knowing that there are decisions being made about these different types of services at every level of government. It's always helpful if you can draw direct connections to local issues that might be going on, or school board elections if education is important to them. And we always work as a statewide organization to equip our nonprofit partners with as much local information as possible, especially if they do have mayoral or municipal election coming up, to definitely be aware of that. And then we also work on statewide ballot measures. And so there will be a number of measures this year in Colorado that relate to taxes and kind of other fiscal matters that will directly relate to transportation, to education. And so we can kind of bring those into the conversation. But again, asking them those questions first. That top question, it might be a rhetorical question. Maybe it's just something for them to ponder, and they may not have an answer on the spot. But then the most important question here is really, what questions do you have about being able to vote in the next election? And this question is where it can really diverge and give us information as to what information this particular person might be looking for. So for instance, they might say like, what election? Didn't know there was an election this year. Especially in these kind of off election years, people may be unaware that election is happening. And so giving them that information about dates. So we'll have postcards created that have information about the November election that will be coming up, and any other municipal elections that they should be aware of for where they live. But that kind of opens that door to them, provide them with that information. They might say, oh, they know the election's coming up, but they have questions about their eligibility or whether or not they're registered or how they could check if they're registered. And at that point, we can kind of shift to that script of asking them, showing them how they can check their registration, walking through some eligibility requirements with them that are true here in the state of Colorado. Or, maybe they're just uninterested and they say, I just don't vote. Like, I don't believe in the power of my vote. And those can be more challenging conversations. And I find that they often are not resolved in one conversation. But luckily, if you are doing voter engagement at a service provider site where folks do come to receive services on a pretty regular basis, I find that if this is consistently offered, maybe the third or fourth time seeing folks out there having these conversations, someone might be inclined to say like, okay, let me check my registration. Let me see. Clearly the organization is prioritizing this. And so this tool has just been really helpful for us. Again, easy to have in the field. It maybe doesn't create perfect conversations with every voter we engage, but it has certainly guided us through a number of conversations that we believe have led to more meaningful outcomes for that individual. We can go to the next slide. The other kind of strategy we use, as I said, working with nonprofits all across the state and delivering different types of services. We work with a lot of food distribution sites, community health centers, family resource centers, is really just trying to connect with those voters. How elected officials might be making decisions about some of the services that they're even receiving from that site, and how those organizations might be depending on funding from the government to keep their services open and be able to meet the community need. Go to the next slide. This is getting the formatting is a little off, but also just reminding folks, that these elected officials do have a direct impact in our lives, whether it's at the city, state, national level. Elected officials create and shape the laws that will impact the current and future nutrition, health, economic security, and education of our children and families. And you can just click through the rest. They have a big impact on how funding is distributed across those programs, and also in kind of the recovery of COVID, reminding folks that those elected officials do make significant decisions, especially as kind of restrictions are being more carried out at the local level around how our county, how our city is responding to the COVID pandemic. And I want to wrap things up here, but I think I have 2 more slides. I just wanted to show you all a couple of things examples of kind of what we've used in the field. We do create ballot guides, not only educating folks about what to expect on the ballot, but also like how items even get onto the ballot. And so here in Colorado, we have citizen-initiated ballot measures as well as referred ballot measures, educating people about that, and then providing kind of both sides of all the ballot measures so they can just be better informed. So that's one example. And then next slide. We also create pledges to vote. This is an example of draft of what ours is going to look like this year. At the top, we would collect folks' information, their address, phone number, so that we can follow up with them, but also having them kind of walk through these steps of ensuring they're registered, that they are at their current address, they know key dates and deadlines, and having them identify for themselves kind of why they plan to vote instead of telling them why we think they should. And then again, they can identify how they'd like to be followed up and in what language. And then on the back side of this, the next slide, we will be collecting information about the types of information that, like what happened during that interaction, what information was given to the voter. Did we go through the Why Vote tool? Did we discuss ballot measures? And this will hopefully allow us after the program to evaluate the impact of how these different sorts of discussions and tools maybe impact voter turnout for those individuals when it comes to the election. So that was a whirlwind, but I want to make sure we have time for questions. And so hopefully that was just a sneak peek into kind of how we run things here in Colorado.
Thank you so much, Alex. People seem to really respond to the Why Vote tool. And people asked where they can obtain a copy of the Why Vote card.
Great, yeah, and this tool is relatively new to us too, but we have found it to be incredibly useful. I can put a link in the chat here, or it looks like someone already has, great. They also have an online version of the tool, and they do have the tool in Spanish and English. They also have a youth-centered version of the tool that kind of uses slightly different icons, but maybe is more effective if you're talking with a younger voting population.
Great. We love our friends over at the Right Question Institute that developed the Why Vote tool. So we will make sure that we include a link to Right Question Institute so that you can access that yourselves. We'll include that in the follow-up email to everyone who RSVP'd. It'll be included with the slides and the recordings. And so now we can get into my favorite part of these webinars, which is the Q&A session. All right, and so I think we can stop the screen share and just have it be a little panel. Folks are welcome to still add any questions they have. So I'm gonna go back to an early one. Brian, maybe you can offer your thoughts on this. Someone asked, you know, is this a chicken or the egg kind of situation? Does registering to vote or voting cause greater social engagement, or does social engagement lead to voting?
That is a good question. I saw that pop up very, very early on in the webinar. And I think that's the one, I think almost all those reasons for voting and benefits of voting are generally one way. That's the one that I think operates in two ways. In that, yes, people who are more socially connected are more likely to vote, period. It's obvious that it works that way. But I would argue that it also works the other way, is that as people vote, they get, because part of the reason when, you know, part of what we're doing here, when you are talking to someone who's feeling very disenchanted, very disconnected from society, powerless, they feel isolated. They are isolated. The act of you having that conversation with them breaks that isolation down, starts chipping away at them. They cast that first vote. Maybe they haven't voted in 10, 15 years. Maybe they've never voted. You're getting them to cast that first vote. That is a sense of empowerment for them. And then there's this magical thing that happens. Once a person starts voting, they show up on the voting rolls as a likely or somewhat likely voter, and they start getting calls from candidates and campaigns as well. So, you know, they also start getting more communication from others about, hey, here's these issues. I see you voted. Let me talk to you about these issues that are important. It does work both ways. So yes, absolutely. People who have a sense of social connectedness are more likely to vote. But the conversations we're having at the health centers, the conversations we're having at the food pantries, is also breaking down the sense of isolation that some people have. So it works both ways.
Thanks, Brian. I'll pose this next one to you, Alex. We actually had two questions come in right after one right after the other, that I think really speak to the same thing. The idea is that for a lot of the people that our nonprofits serve, they have their daily material needs that they're trying to meet, trying to get the rent paid, childcare, multiple jobs, transportation challenges. Maybe their neighborhood really hasn't changed much in a long time. They have low confidence in the system. So what messages are impactful and effective for connecting with folks in these communities that face these challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's probably different depending on where you're doing your work and what the community is. I think, like I mentioned, we support nonprofits across the state, and we really try to work with our partners to understand the communities they work in, understand their concerns, and then help them craft messaging to meet those needs. I think in terms of like not having time, one of the ways in which we're helping to kind of get through that barrier is by meeting them where they're at. So if they're able to get this information and register to vote while they are waiting in line to get their food or waiting for their child to have their health appointment, then they're not having to do an extra step to get registered. So that's definitely helpful. And definitely last year, as we saw people having to wait in longer and longer lines, unfortunately, they had plenty of time. That was sort of idle time for them to be engaged in these conversations. I think the question about how do you encourage them that it's worth their time to vote when they feel kind of discouraged, that's a much harder one. And again, I turn to just asking questions and trying to understand where they're coming from, asking them, why they feel like their vote doesn't matter, and understanding if there's like a particular incident that happened in the past, and then trying to point out for them things that have happened locally that have been community driven. So whether it's something small like a park that went in, or the name changed in a park, or a street like that got put in. And if you know of any projects like that that were really brought forward by community members and community driven, and being able to show them the power that individuals in the community can have to create very small incremental change, then that eventually leads to larger change.
Great. So of course, that's sort of like a micro level. We had a few questions come in that are a little more macro, and they're kind of about policy, election policy. So Brian, we had someone ask about, policies that might restrict certain forms of voting. We also had a question about ranked choice voting and how it could expand voting. Can you just speak a little bit to the role that policy plays in turnout, and sort of how nonprofits can grapple with that?
Sure. Well, I think there's two sets of policies that relate to this. The first set of policies are policies that impact turnout more directly. And we recently released a report called America Goes to the Polls, which ranked all 50 states in voter turnout. And we basically drew correlations between policies that states at the top of the ranking had in common. And so states with the highest turnout generally tended to have same-day voter registration. They generally tended to make voting at home or voting by mail very easy, if not proactively sending everyone a mail-in ballot ahead of time. And by comparison, states at the other end of the spectrum had 4-week deadlines and made mail-in votings very difficult. And so those were the two of the policies that we saw the strongest correlation with turnout with. Again, same-day registration, a little bit about same-day registration. Many states still have 4-week registration deadlines. And the problem that arises, and this goes back to the earlier conversation we were having about presidential elections, there's so much noise going on in a presidential election. It's hard not to know there's an election happening, but it is easy to miss the registration deadline. So, maybe you didn't know you lived in a 4-week state, you moved across state lines or halfway across the state. And the only choice you have now, it's 2 weeks before election, you're like, oh, right, this race is happening. The only choice you have, you really don't. You can either drive across the state to your old polling location or, somehow cast a ballot. There's a few exceptions, but it gets really complicated and cumbersome. Same states with same-day registration make that much, much easier. And which is why they had, I think, a 5 percentage point turnout advantage over states without, same-day registration. And that's just that one policy. States with vote at home also have a positive benefit. Now, there's an interesting thing, and since we're talking about local elections, that there's a lot of research that shows the voting by mail has its biggest impact in local elections. And the reason for that is pretty clear. If every registered voter is mailed a ballot in the county with who's running for city council, who's running for the mayoral races, one, they have time, as we talked about earlier, one of the challenges between these low salience elections is people often don't know it's happening. They don't know who the candidates are. If they show up at the polls, there's a lot of times they're seeing names for the first time when they get to the polling booth and they're confused. And so they skip the race. If you're sitting at your kitchen table, you can spend some time studying those ballots and making informed decisions. And that significantly increases turnout. Other policies that do contribute, automatic voter registration has shown some positive impact in turnout as well. I think the ranked choice voting, I have not seen information that says it significantly boosts turnout. And maybe there is, I just haven't seen good research on that front. There's not enough states that have it. So the way we did the analysis, we couldn't look at ranked choice voting because our analysis is based on state by state comparison. And there's only one state that ran ranked choice voting statewide. Right. And so we couldn't really do a decent comparison. If we get to a point where we've got 10 states that are running ranked choice voting, then we can start doing this kind of analysis. We just don't have the capacity yet. But intuitively, you would think it would. The second set of policies are policies that are more indirect, and sorry to get long-winded, but those are a little bit trickier. And those are the policies that impact third-party groups doing voter registration and voter engagement work. Texas and Florida are the most notorious in that they make it difficult for third-party groups to do voter registration drives. Texas requires you to take courses, go to the, basically get certified to collect voter registrations. Most states, you just go to the elections office, you ask for a stack of forms, and you turn them in within a certain time frame, and that's all you have to do. And so that's the separate set of rules, and those have a more direct impact on third parties or nonprofits doing voter engagement work.
Thanks. Okay, the next question is going to be a two-parter for you, Alex. So if somebody is asking, how do you even set up this voter registration table? So how would they set up a voter registration table at their events? And do they need someone from the town or state to oversee this?
A great question. And this is likely also different by state, but I can tell you how it works here in Colorado. We do have, so we at CRC have a certification through our Secretary of State to be a voter registration drive. So that's really like that legal part that we need in order to then go out and register other voters. We then are able to train nonprofits. So we work to kind of break down some of the barriers for nonprofits to get involved by training them and providing them with the voter registration forms, making sure they understand all the rules and laws. And then we collect all those completed voter registration forms from them and ensure that they get processed and sent to the correct county clerks within the designated time frame set by the Secretary of State. So I think in many states, there are similar rules around voter registration drives and needing to be certified through a voter registration drive in order to go out and register other voters. Anyone can go kind of online and check your registration, update your registration if you have online voter registration in your state, or download a paper form that then gets mailed in or turned in. But if you're going to be going out and registering other voters and collecting large numbers of forms, definitely check with your Secretary of State's office.
I'm going to throw the Fair Election Center's really helpful guides on how to do voter registration drives as a third party, according to all the state rules. But here's the second part of the question. Somebody was asking about where they could set up one of these tables. Like where is a good location or setting if you want to engage with younger voters? I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah. That's a great question. So mostly we don't think too much about where we're setting up tables because we are working directly with nonprofits and setting up tables at their site or outside their site or at an event that they're having. But we did have a lot of success last year at farmers markets reaching folks because it was outdoor and they were getting food, and it was something that was open. And so we did engage a lot of people, especially in like smaller rural towns in Colorado. That's a big place where like everyone in the community is going over the weekend. In terms of engaging younger voters, if there's an opportunity to be connected with schools, I think that's been really successful for our partners at New Era, who focus on registering young voters. So working with colleges and high schools, even in Colorado, we can get people registered at the age of 16 and 17. So they're like pre-registered and receive their ballot as soon as they turn 18. They've also shown up at like concerts, outdoor concerts. It does seem like this summer we're going to have more like outdoor gatherings opening up in our state. And so there will be opportunities to meet young folks where they are. I'm going to mute myself.
They always start right at the end of the webinar. Mine was doing it earlier. But I think that is like a really good place to actually leave us off for the day, because I think the idea is you want to meet voters where they're at. So if you want to reach young voters, reach them where they go. So whether that's at school or a nonprofit that serves them or another place, ask young people, I think. And the same goes to any voter, like where are they actually already going to be? That's the best place to find them and register them and engage them. And of course, listen, as you said earlier, Alex. So I want to thank everyone as we approach the end of this hour. If you want to help us out, and I hope you will fill out the survey that will appear once you exit the webinar. Give us some feedback. Let us know what other types of topics or who else we'd like to see as a speaker. That's really valuable information for us. And you'll see an email in your inbox next week with the recording, the slides, and some links to additional resources like the Right Question Institute and our new Benefits of Voting resource. So on behalf of the Nonprofit Vote team, thank you, Alex, and thank you to everyone who attended today's webinar. I hope you have a great rest of your week.